During the wedding, the father noticed something strange about the bride. Suddenly, he interrupted the ceremony. What he discovered left everyone in shock. During the wedding rehearsal, Andrew Brown noticed something that no one else did. Sitting in the front row of the cathedral, he watched his daughter, Sarah, walk toward the altar. Her hands trembled. It wasn't a violent tremor, but it was enough to unsettle him. Her smile seemed forced, and there was a strange gleam in her eyes, something between hesitation and fear. Beside him, Elizabeth Brown, his wife, watched the scene with pride. To her, this wedding was the culmination of years of hard work. Joining Sarah to Daniel Miller would solidify the Brown family's position in the highest echelons of Mexican society. "Andrew, what's with that face?" Elizabeth asked, not taking her eyes off the rehearsal. "Did you notice Sarah's hands?" he murmured. "Oh, Andrew, please, she's nervous. Marrying someone like Daniel isn't exactly a small thing." He didn't respond. Maybe it was just nerves, but something deep inside him told him it wasn't. Daniel Miller waited at the altar, his posture impeccable. Heir to one of the country's most influential hotel chains, he was seen as the perfect son-in-law, polite, always smiling, always in control. But Andrew never trusted him. There was something in the way Daniel looked at Sarah, the way he spoke for her, how he kept his hand on her arm or waist, as if marking territory. Small details that most people ignored, but that Andrew, a man with years of experience, noticed clearly. Then, 3 days earlier, he saw the bruise. It was during a family lunch. Sarah was wearing a long-sleeved dress, unusual for the time of year. When she reached for a glass, her sleeve pulled up slightly, revealing a purplish mark on her wrist. "What happened here?" Andrew asked immediately. Sarah quickly pulled her hand away. "It's nothing, Dad. I tripped on the stairs." He saw the hesitation in her eyes, the urgency to change the subject. But Elizabeth, busy with the final wedding preparations, didn't even pay attention. Now, seeing Sarah at the altar, gripping the bouquet tighter than necessary, Andrew knew he couldn't ignore what he was feeling. Daniel was respected, influential, powerful. But something was wrong. Andrew could feel it. If his daughter was in danger, he would do anything to protect her, even if it meant interrupting the wedding. That night seemed endless for Andrew Brown. Since the wedding rehearsal, the image of Sarah's trembling hands and the bruise on her wrist had haunted him. The following evening, sitting at his desk, he tried to focus on the papers in front of him, but the words blurred together. The silence in the house only amplified his unease. The clock read almost midnight when he heard a soft knock on the door. "Dad?" Sarah's voice was low, fragile. Andrew immediately sensed that something was wrong. "Come in, sweetheart." Sarah opened the door slowly and closed it behind her. Her eyes were red, as if she had been crying for hours. She approached the desk, but hesitated before speaking. Andrew noticed her hands tightly clasped together, a gesture that revealed fear and anxiety. "What happened?" he asked gently, though he couldn't hide his concern. She took a deep breath, as though gathering courage. When she finally lifted her eyes to meet his, her voice cracked. "I can't marry Daniel." Andrew felt an instant sense of relief upon hearing those words, but that feeling was quickly replaced by a cold shiver down his spine. If Sarah was saying this now, just days before the wedding, it meant something far more serious was behind it. "Tell me the truth, Sarah. What's going on?" She looked away, running her hands over her face, trying to hold back tears. "He's not who everyone thinks he is. He controls me, Dad. Every step I take, every message I receive, he always knows. He doesn't let me make any decision without going through him first." With each word, the anger inside Andrew grew. "You're telling me he's spying on you?" She nodded slowly. "He has people around him, Dad. Contacts. People who do whatever he tells them without question. If I go somewhere he hasn't approved, somehow he always finds out. He knows where I am, who I talk to, What I do?" Andrew's chest tightened. How had he not seen this before? How had he let his daughter reach this point? "And why didn't you tell me before?" he asked, trying to hold back his harsh tone. Sarah laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "Because I tried to break up with him, Dad. 3 times. Andrew froze. "What?" "I tried to leave him, but every time he made me go back. Always with the same threat." She ran her hand over her face again, as if reliving those painful moments. "He says he has documents against our family." Andrew furrowed his brow. "What kind of documents?" "Proofs of fraud, illegal transactions, things that could destroy Brown Enterprises. He said that if I leave him, he'll expose everything. Not just to ruin you, but to harm other families that depend on our company's business." The air seemed to leave Andrew's lungs. His mind raced, trying to understand how Daniel could have something like that. This is a bluff. He's manipulating you. What if it's not? Andrew stood up and started pacing around the room, his heart pounding. Now it all made sense. Sarah's change in behavior over the past few months, her lack of enthusiasm for the wedding, that damn bruise. "I've never signed anything illegal. I've never been involved in that kind of thing," he muttered, mostly to himself. "But what about Mom?" Sarah whispered. Andrew stopped in his tracks. "What?" She took a deep breath before answering. "You know how Mom has always done everything to maintain appearances, to make sure we didn't fall, and I don't know how far she went for that." The thought that Elizabeth might have been involved in something irregular made Andrew feel even more powerless. He looked back at Sarah. "You're not marrying him. I promise you that." Sarah's expression was one of relief, but also fear. "Dad, if Daniel finds out that we're against him, he might act before we do." "Leave that to me," he assured her. Deep down, Andrew knew that stopping the wedding wasn't enough. He had to destroy Daniel before he had the chance to carry out his threats. But there was an even bigger problem: Elizabeth. He knew his wife well. For her, this marriage was the only way to save the company from bankruptcy and to keep the Brown name intact. Convincing her that Daniel was dangerous would be nearly impossible. If you're watching this far, I'm sure you're liking it. So I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. Andrew Brown wasted no time. After his conversation with Sarah, he knew he needed to act before it was too late. His first thought was to seek out Robert Carter, an old friend and one of the most influential lawyers in New York. If anyone could find a legal way to stop this wedding, it was him. Robert's office was located at the top of a towering building on Fifth Avenue. Andrew arrived unannounced, and the secretary tried to stop him, claiming that the lawyer was in a meeting. But Andrew didn't accept excuses. "Tell him Andrew Brown is here, it's urgent." Minutes later, he was led into a spacious room where Robert was waiting behind a mahogany desk, surrounded by shelves full of legal books. He stood to greet him, surprised by the unexpected visit. "Andrew, long time no see. What brings you here?" Andrew wasted no time on pleasantries. He sat down and went straight to the point. "I need to stop my daughter's wedding." The serious tone and tense expression made Robert raise an eyebrow. "That's not something simple. Does she want to cancel?" "Yes, but she can't. Daniel is threatening her." At the mention of Daniel's name, Robert leaned back in his chair. He knew Daniel Miller from social events and was well aware of his influence. "How is he threatening her?" "Blackmail. He says he has documents that could ruin the company and other powerful families, and he controls Sarah's every move." Robert sat in silence for a few seconds, analyzing the situation. If he really has these documents, pursuing a legal action now might be risky. If we push without proof, he might act before we can. "That's why I'm here. I need you to help me find a way to stop this wedding before it happens." Robert tapped his fingers on the desk, deep in thought. "I have a contact who can help us, David Wilson. He's a former cop, now a private investigator. If Daniel has something shady, David will find it. Andrew nodded. Then hire him. While Andrew was taking action to stop Daniel, Sarah was feeling the pressure mount every day. The calls had become more frequent. Daniel was demanding that she show more enthusiasm for the wedding. "You've been distant, Sarah. This is starting to bother me." His voice on the phone was calm, but there was a hidden tone of threat. "I'm just tired, Daniel. There's so much going on." "Then I want to see you tomorrow. Dinner at my apartment, just the two of us." She had no choice. The following day, at the restaurant where they met, Daniel held her hand tightly across the table. "You know what's at stake, don't you?" Sarah tried to hide the fear. "I know," he smiled. "Then let's make things easier. Stop acting like you're against this. The wedding is happening, Sarah, and I expect to see you smiling at the altar." She nodded, feeling the pressure of his grip on her skin. Andrew was searching for unexpected allies. He met with Father Charles in the sacristy of the cathedral where the ceremony would take place. The priest, a man with a serene gaze, listened intently to everything Andrew had to say. When he finished, Charles folded his hands on the table. "If your daughter doesn't want this marriage, I can't bless it. The church doesn't allow forced unions." "Then you'll help us?" The priest nodded. "But we need to make sure Sarah speaks up at the altar. If she says she doesn't want this, no one can force her to continue." Andrew felt a weight lift off his shoulders. "Thank you, Father." "Protect your daughter, Andrew. This man doesn't seem worthy of her." David Wilson was already on the case. With years of experience in the police force, he knew exactly where to start. By discreetly following Daniel, he discovered that he had been meeting with a man named Charles Lewis. The name wasn't unfamiliar. Lewis was known for his shady business dealings, involved in money laundering and extortion. When he received his first update from David, Robert immediately called Andrew. "We've got a lead. Daniel has dangerous connections. If we dig deeper, we can bring him down." Andrew gripped the phone tightly. "Then do it. We don't have much time." He knew the battle had just begun, and that Daniel Miller wouldn't fall without a fight. Daniel didn't like feeling like he was losing control. Over the past few days, Sarah had been different. More quiet, more distant, short answers, avoided glances. It bothered him. He knew her too well to ignore the signs. Something was going on. That's why that night he invited her to dinner at one of New York's most exclusive restaurants. The place had a sophisticated atmosphere, dim lighting, and waiters who moved with absolute discretion. Daniel made sure to reserve a private space, away from prying eyes and ears. He wanted to make sure Sarah would speak freely, or better yet, that she wouldn't have any choice but to speak. When she arrived, she looked as impeccable as always. Elegant dress, well-arranged hair, subtle makeup. But something was different. There was a weight on her shoulders, a tiredness in her eyes. Daniel stood to greet her, holding her hand just a little too long. "You look stunning, my love," he said with his perfect smile. Sarah forced a smile and sat down. "Thank you." The courses were served quickly, accompanied by an expensive wine Daniel insisted on picking. He spoke as if everything was perfect, describing their honeymoon plans, the final wedding details, as if nothing was out of place. But his eyes were sharp. He watched every gesture, every hesitation. "You seem restless," he commented after taking a sip of wine. "I'm just tired," Sarah responded, avoiding his gaze. Daniel set his utensils down and leaned slightly forward. "I hope that's all it is. Because you know, Sarah, I've invested a lot in this wedding and I don't like surprises." She felt a chill run down her spine. "I don't know what you're talking about." Daniel leaned back in his chair and smiled, but his eyes said something else. "Let's enjoy the night. The big day is almost here." Sarah lowered her gaze to her plate, feeling a knot in her throat. Daniel didn't need to raise his voice to scare her. He was meticulous, cold, always calculating each word, each movement. And in that moment, She knew he suspected something. While Sarah tried to hide her nervousness, Andrew and Robert were receiving a piece of information that could change everything. David Wilson had finally found someone willing to speak about Daniel. Brian Ibanez, a former employee of the Miller Network, knew exactly how he operated. "Daniel keeps a personal file on powerful people," Brian said, lighting a cigarette with slightly trembling hands. "Businessmen, politicians, government officials. He collects secrets. If someone displeases him, he uses what he has to force them to do what he wants." Robert exchanged a quick glance with Andrew before asking, "Can you prove this?" Brian slowly exhaled the smoke, as if weighing the risks. "If I had proof, I'd already be dead." "Then why are you speaking now?" He gave a bitter laugh. "Because I know that sooner or later he's going to catch up with me. I've worked for him for years. I know how he plays. But if I get something that can take him down, I want protection and I want money." Andrew leaned forward, impatient. "How much?" $100,000 and a safe place to leave the country." Robert sighed. "We need to make sure your information is worth that price." Brian stubbed out the cigarette in the ashtray and looked directly at Andrew. "Give me a few days. I'll get something. But you need to guarantee that if I bring it, you won't leave me hanging." Robert nodded. "If you bring solid proof, we'll ensure your safety." Andrew didn't like dealing with this kind of people, but he was willing to do anything to save his daughter. Meanwhile, as the two schemed against Daniel, Sarah was making her own decision. The morning after the dinner, she went to the Brown mansion, determined to speak with her mother. She had avoided this conversation up until now, but she could no longer put it off. Elizabeth was sitting in one of the salons, reviewing the final details of the wedding with a team of organizers. When Sarah entered, she didn't even look up. "If you've come to talk about the dress, we've already scheduled the last fitting for tomorrow." Sarah took a deep breath. "I'm not getting married, Mom." Elizabeth froze for a moment before lifting her eyes, her face hardening into a stern expression. "What did you say?" "I can't marry Daniel. I tried, but I can't." Elizabeth slowly stood up, dismissing the organizers with a wave. When they were alone, she crossed her arms. "Are you out of your mind?" "No, Mom. I was out of my mind before, thinking I could accept this. I don't love Daniel. He controls me. He threatens me. Can't you see that?" Elizabeth narrowed her eyes. "Do you have any idea what you're saying? What this could mean? This isn't just about you, Sarah. The future of our family depends on this marriage." "I'm not a business deal, Mom. I'm your daughter." "Stop playing the victim. You knew what was at stake from the beginning. You're not going to ruin everything over a whim." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. "It's not a whim. It's my life." Elizabeth stepped closer, her gaze as hard as steel. "If you do this, Sarah, you'll destroy your family. Your father won't be able to protect you from the scandal. He won't be able to stop Daniel from getting revenge. If he exposes those documents he has on us, everything we've built will be reduced to dust." Sarah's tears burned her eyes. "So you'd rather protect the business than me?" Elizabeth remained silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold. "Don't you dare put me against the wall, Sarah." The disappointment tore through Sarah's chest. She looked at her mother as though she no longer recognized her. "If I can't count on you, then I'll end this myself." She turned and left the room without waiting for a response, her heart racing, her hands sweating. She knew her mother wouldn't help her. She knew Daniel wouldn't give up easily. But at that moment, she decided she would no longer be anyone's prisoner. The conversation with Elizabeth still echoed in Sarah's mind when she entered her father's office that night. Andrew's worried look confirmed that he too felt the weight of the approaching days. Nothing they had done so far had been enough to stop Daniel, and the ceremony was getting closer by the minute. Andrew's phone rang, interrupting the silence. It was Robert. The lawyer sounded more tense than usual. Brian has signed the statement. Andrew closed his eyes for a moment. That was an important step. He put the call on speakerphone so Sarah could hear. What exactly did he reveal? Everything, Robert replied. He detailed how Daniel uses confidential information to blackmail businessmen, manipulating contracts and threatening to ruin careers. He named specific cases, individuals who have already caved to his pressure. It's enough to open a formal investigation. Sarah felt a spark of hope, but Robert quickly extinguished it with his next words. But it's still not enough to get him behind bars. The disappointment in Andrew's expression was clear. What more do we need? We need more concrete proof. Brian provided valuable details, but his word alone won't hold up in a strong criminal case. The official investigation is starting, but Daniel still has room to defend himself. Sarah crossed her arms tightly over her chest. Even after all this effort, they still didn't have something definitive. So he can keep threatening us? She asked. For now, yes, Robert confirmed. But any wrong move from him now could be interpreted as attempted coercion, and that could speed up the police's response. If he reacts violently or tries to force the marriage in some way, the authorities will be able to act faster. Andrew ran his hand over his face, exhausted. We need him to back down on his own. And how are we going to do that? Sarah asked. We need to corner him. Make him realize that the walls are closing in, Robert said. But we must be careful. The call ended, but Andrew and Sarah knew that the battle was far from over. Meanwhile, Daniel was beginning to suspect something was wrong. Over the last few hours, Sarah had ignored some of his calls, something she had never done before. When she finally answered, her voice sounded distant. Where have you been? He asked, his tone low but full of authority. Home, she replied quickly. Really? Because I have the feeling that you're hiding something from me. Sarah's heart raced. You're imagining things, Daniel. I'm just tired. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. I hope you're telling me the truth. You know what's at stake. Sarah felt the hidden threat behind those words. She hung up the phone, a cold shiver running down her spine. He knew something was going on. The next day, the preparations for the wedding were in full swing. Elizabeth seemed to ignore any signs that her daughter didn't want to get married. The house was filled with stylists, organizers, and assistants making final adjustments. The dress was ready, the flowers had been ordered, and the guest list was set. Sarah watched it all like she was stuck in a play where everyone was acting their parts without noticing that something was terribly wrong. Elizabeth pulled her by the arm amid the chaos. Tomorrow, we have the final dress fitting. I want you to stop looking like you're at a funeral, Sarah. Mom, I don't want to hear anything else. The wedding is happening. You're going into that church and you're going to smile like a Brown. Sarah took a deep breath, holding back tears. You haven't heard me until now, have you? Elizabeth grabbed her face with both hands. I have heard you, but I've also heard Daniel. He came to speak to me today. Sarah's blood ran cold. What did he say? He said you were nervous, that you might be influenced by your father, but that he understands your hesitation. She laughed without humor. He understands. Elizabeth narrowed her eyes. He said that if you really don't want the marriage, he'll accept it, but that would have consequences. Sarah felt her stomach churn. Of course, Daniel would mask the threat with false courtesy. He wanted Elizabeth to see him as a reasonable man, when in fact he was simply tightening his control. And what about you, Mom? Do you really think he's telling the truth? Elizabeth looked away for a moment before responding. We don't have a choice. Sarah pulled away from her mother's grip. I do. She turned and left the room without looking back. Her heart pounded in her chest. The wedding trap was closing in, and she needed to find a way out before it was too late. Daniel didn't like leaving loose ends. The feeling that Sarah was slipping from his control bothered him more than he was willing to admit. The wedding was just days away, and yet something about her demeanor didn't feel right. That's why, that night, he made sure to invite her to dinner alone. He called her to one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, a place where silence and privacy were guaranteed. Sarah knew she couldn't refuse. From the moment she received his message, she felt a tightness in her chest. There was a weight in every word. "I want this to be a special night for us." She knew there was nothing special about that night. Daniel wanted to evaluate whether she was still under his control. When she arrived at the restaurant, a waiter greeted her and led her directly to the table where he was waiting. Daniel stood up to greet her with a kiss on the cheek, holding her hand a little longer than necessary. "You look stunning, my love," he said, with an impeccable smile. Sarah sat down and forced a smile. "Thank you." The dishes were served quickly, accompanied by a very expensive wine Daniel insisted on choosing. He spoke as if everything were perfect, describing the honeymoon plans, the final wedding details, as if nothing were out of place. But his eyes were attentive. He was watching every gesture, every hesitation. "You seem uneasy," he remarked, after taking a sip of wine. "I'm just tired," Sarah replied, avoiding his gaze. Daniel set his utensils down and leaned slightly forward. "I hope that's all it is. I wouldn't like to think that there's something you're not telling me." Sarah felt a chill run through her spine. "Why do you think that?" He smiled, but his eyes were cold. "Because I have the impression that some people are filling your head with nonsense, and I'd be very disappointed if you listened to those wrong influences." She knew at that moment that he suspected something. "Daniel, don't interrupt me, Sarah." He maintained his soft tone, but the threat was clear. "I've invested too much in this wedding, and you know what that means." Sarah felt her hand trembling as she held the wine glass. "I would never do anything to hurt you." Daniel studied her for a moment before smiling again, picking up his knife and fork and cutting his meat as if nothing had happened. "Great, because tomorrow we have the final dress fitting, and I want to see you smiling as the perfect bride I know you are." The dinner ended without further heavy words, but the silence between them said everything. When Sarah got home, her body was trembling. Daniel's words echoed in her mind. Every sentence was a veiled threat, a warning that he knew something was wrong. She hurried up the stairs and knocked on her father's office door. Andrew was sitting reviewing documents when he saw her enter. His expression changed immediately. "What happened?" Sarah closed the door and leaned against it, breathing deeply. "He knows, Dad." Andrew stood up. "What do you mean?" "He knows I'm hesitating, that people are trying to help me. He's watching me." She told him about the dinner, the threatening tone Daniel used, and how he made it clear that any mistake on her part would have consequences. Andrew clenched his fists. "I'll take care of that bastard. Dad, he has those documents. He wants me to feel cornered." Andrew grabbed the phone and dialed Robert's number. Minutes later, the lawyer was already at the Brown house. "This is moving too fast," Robert said, crossing his arms. "If Daniel has figured it out, he might take even more aggressive actions." Andrew ran his hand over his face, trying to contain his rage. "So, what do we do?" "We need to be careful. If he realizes he's losing, he may strike first. The best strategy right now is to make him believe he's still in control." Sarah shook her head. "I can't keep pretending." "I know it's hard, but we need to be strategic," Robert insisted. "If we confront him head-on now, he might get ahead of us and act first." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm her breathing. "I won't let him win." The next morning, Elizabeth began to notice that something was different. For the first time, she observed her daughter closely. She saw her pale face, the tiredness in her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. When she found Sarah alone in the living room, she sat beside her. "Sarah, tell me the truth." Sarah looked at her mother and saw something she hadn't expected. Genuine concern. "Mom, he's threatening me." Elizabeth frowned. "Daniel?" Sarah nodded, her voice breaking. "He knows I don't want this marriage. And he's constantly reminding me what he can do to our family if I don't go through with it." Elizabeth was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer. "I thought he was the best option for you. I thought I was securing your future." "But what about my present?" Sarah retorted, tears streaming down her face. "I'm trapped, Mom." Elizabeth looked away, as though she couldn't bear to face her. "I need to think." Sarah realized that for the first time, her mother was considering another option. Later that night, locked in her room, Sarah made her own decision. She grabbed her phone and sent a single message to Andrew. "I won't back down anymore." She knew that at the altar, Daniel expected her to cave. He expected fear to be stronger than her will. But for the first time in a long time, she felt she had something more powerful than fear. The courage to end it all. The day everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. The Manhattan Cathedral, one of New York's most imposing temples, was stunning. The golden light from the stained glass windows cast colorful reflections throughout the church, while hundreds of lit candles illuminated the altar with a solemn glow. Huge arrangements of white roses and lilies filled the space, their delicate fragrance filling the air. Guests dressed in the finest attire took their seats, eagerly awaiting what was being called the wedding of the year. The presence of influential figures from politics and business made this event a spectacle in itself. Businessmen, socialites, and even members of traditional families from Spain and the United States were among the guests. But outside the cathedral, another presence caught the eye. The journalists, reporters from various channels and news outlets were positioned at the entrance, ready to capture every detail of the wedding between Sarah Brown and Daniel Miller. Some gossip magazines had already speculated on rumors about the bride's hesitation, while other outlets praised the grandeur of the ceremony. No one knew for sure what would happen inside the church. They only waited for the spectacle that would unfold. Inside the sacristy, away from the public's gaze, Andrew Brown adjusted the cuffs of his shirt while watching his daughter in the mirror. Sarah was sitting, her gaze fixed on her own reflection. The white dress hugged her silhouette perfectly, a classic and luxurious design made exclusively for her. Her hair, tied in a delicate bun, was adorned with a diamond tiara that had belonged to Elizabeth's family. Everything about her screamed perfection, but her eyes were filled with a whirlwind of emotions. "There's still time to change your mind," Andrew said, crossing his arms. Sarah let out a weak laugh, not breaking her gaze from the mirror. "There's no turning back, Dad. I need to do this." He approached and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Are you sure?" She took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes. I need to end this once and for all." Andrew wanted to believe everything would go according to plan, but there was a quiet fear inside him. Daniel was not a man who would accept being contradicted. The presence of the press was an advantage for Sarah, but it could also make her an even bigger target. On the other side of the church, Daniel awaited at the altar. His perfectly tailored black suit only highlighted his impeccable posture. He stood erect, exuding an air of absolute confidence. His eyes scanned the church, observing the guests, the details of the decor, and occasionally exchanging words with his groomsmen. To him, the ceremony was already a done deal. He had played all his cards right. He controlled Sarah with fear, ensured that Elizabeth was on his side, and above all, eliminated any chance of her running away. There was no way she could back out now, not in front of so many people, not with the media watching. When he saw Elizabeth seated in the front row, he smiled discreetly. He knew that the matriarch of the Brown family would never let a scandal tarnish their name. By this point, even if Sarah tried to do something, her mother would make her go through with the wedding. In the sacristy, Father Charles entered and gestured for Andrew and Sarah to prepare. "It's time to start." Sarah stood slowly, feeling the weight of the moment in her legs. Andrew watched her closely, trying to decipher her thoughts. "You can do this," he whispered, holding her hand. She looked at him for a brief moment before tightening her grip on his hand. The doors of the church opened. The murmurs among the guests ceased, and the organ began to play the traditional wedding march. Sarah began walking. She felt every eye on her. The flashes from the press outside illuminated the entrance of the cathedral. With each step, the distance between her and Daniel closed, and her breathing grew heavier. The knot in her throat tightened. Daniel watched her from a distance, maintaining his confident smile. To him, everything was going exactly as planned, but he didn't know what was about to happen. Father Charles waited until Sarah positioned herself before Daniel, then made the sign of the cross. "Brothers and sisters, we are gathered here before God to witness the union of Sarah Brown and Daniel Miller." Sarah barely heard the priest's words. Her heart was pounding in her chest. She felt suffocated by the dress, the jewels, the weight of everyone's expectations. She looked at Daniel. He was impassive, analyzing her as he always did, looking for any sign of weakness. She looked at Elizabeth. Her mother maintained a tense smile, but her gaze seemed different. For the first time, Sarah noticed something there, a trace of doubt. She looked at Andrew. Her father stood serious, but his eyes conveyed strength. She closed her eyes for a second, took a deep breath. The moment to act was approaching. The silence in the cathedral was almost suffocating. Sarah felt the gaze of everyone on her, waiting for her to speak the words that would seal her union with Daniel. Father Charles continued with the ritual, his firm voice echoing between the stained glass windows. Each word seemed to resound inside her chest like a hammer, marking the time until the crucial moment. Then came the question. "If anyone knows of any reason why this union should not take place, speak now or forever. Hold your peace." Daniel maintained his serene expression, but his gaze slid discreetly to Sarah, as if already anticipating her answer. He waited for the priest to continue, confident that the ceremony would proceed without interruptions. But then Sarah took a deep breath, and with a firm voice, she broke the silence. "I cannot go through with this marriage." The sound of her own voice seemed to strike like lightning through the cathedral. For a moment, no one reacted. Shock froze everyone in place. All eyes turned to her, incredulous. Journalists outside, aware of the live broadcast, quickly raised their phones to capture the moment. Whispers began to spread through the pews. Elizabeth brought a hand to her mouth, feeling the impact of those words like a blow. Andrew, standing in the back, clenched his fists, feeling a mixture of relief and tension. Daniel took a second to process what he had just heard. His muscles stiffened, his jaw clenched. But soon he regained his composure, trying to maintain calm. He leaned slightly towards Sarah, his voice low and sharp as a blade. "What are you doing?" She kept her gaze fixed on the priest. "I'm saying I cannot marry you." The murmurs among the guests grew louder. Some exchanged shocked glances, others whispered among themselves. The press, waiting outside, tried to capture every image of the unfolding turmoil. Daniel stepped forward, gripping Sarah's wrist with force. "You're making a mistake," he said through clenched teeth, his smile tight and not reaching his eyes. "Think carefully about what you're doing, Sarah. Don't make things harder for yourself." She felt his grip tighten, like a last-ditch attempt to maintain control. But this time, she didn't give in. "Let go of me." Daniel didn't move. "Say it was a mistake," he insisted. "Say you're just nervous. We can talk later." Father Charles saw the desperation in the bride's eyes and intervened, raising his voice. "Daniel, let go of Miss Brown now." Daniel hesitated, but the pressure of the onlookers forced him to obey. Sarah took a step back, gasping for breath. The priest looked at the congregation and then, with a solemn tone, declared, "The church cannot bless a forced union. This ceremony cannot continue." The priest's words fell like a final sentence. The wedding was officially cancelled. Daniel lost his composure. His mask of the perfect man cracked before everyone. "You'll regret this, Sarah," he said, his voice filled with contained rage. "You have no idea what you just did." "I know exactly what I did," she responded, not breaking eye contact. Daniel glanced around. He saw the guests watching him, some surprised, others uncomfortable. He saw journalists capturing his reaction. He saw Elizabeth, frozen, unsure of how to react. Slowly, he realized there was no way to salvage his image. He had lost. Without saying another word, he turned abruptly and began walking toward the exit. His footsteps echoed through the cathedral. The press was waiting for him outside, ready to turn this moment into headlines. The man who had controlled everything was now exposed to the world. Elizabeth remained seated in the pew long after Daniel had left. The murmurs of the guests echoed around her, but she could barely process what had just happened. The scandal she had feared had come to life right before her eyes. Her daughter had rejected Daniel Miller in front of New York's elite, in front of the press, in front of the world. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. The flashes from the journalists at the entrance to the cathedral shone through the stained glass windows, a cruel reminder that this wouldn't stay here. The next day, the newspapers would headline this incident, and the comments in social circles would be ruthless. The Brown family, once synonymous with prestige, would now be remembered for this disgrace. Her vision blurred. She wasn't sure if it was anger, shame, or simple shock that made her feel this way, but her life, which she had so meticulously planned, seemed to be crumbling in a matter of minutes. But then she looked at Sarah. Her daughter, still breathing heavily, was holding Andrew's hand tightly. There was fear in her eyes, but also relief. For the first time in a long time, Elizabeth saw Sarah breathe without the weight of an invisible burden. And it was in that moment that something inside her broke. All her life, she had believed that status and power were everything, that maintaining appearances meant securing her family's future. But now, looking at her own daughter, she realized that she had almost handed her over to a man who would suffocate her until there was nothing left. Her chest tightened, and she looked away, unable to meet Sarah's gaze any longer. But there was no time to compose herself. Outside the church, chaos awaited them. As they exited, a swarm of journalists rushed toward them. Cameras were raised, microphones shoved into their faces. "Sarah, why did you cancel the wedding? Was Daniel Miller accused of something? Is the Brown family bankrupt? Was this marriage a business arrangement?" Flashes blinded them, voices overlapped, and the crowd closed in around them. Andrew pulled Sarah closer, holding her by the waist as they made their way down the cathedral stairs. "No comments," he said firmly, trying to clear a path. Elizabeth, still dazed, was the last to leave. The barrage of questions hit her like bullets. She, who had always known how to handle the press, now found herself unable to say a word. For the first time, she felt vulnerable in front of them. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Daniel was dealing with his own crisis. The newspapers didn't give him a break. Headlines appeared every minute on news portals. Bride rejects $1 million wedding at the altar. What is Daniel Miller hiding? Wedding of the year turns into scandal. He tried to contain the damage. He gathered his public relations team, instructed his lawyers to prepare statements, but nothing seemed to be enough to control the narrative. The name Miller, once untouchable, was now associated with disgrace. And to make matters worse, rumors began to spread. Small whispers about blackmail and shady business started circulating among businessmen. Daniel knew that if Andrew and Sarah took the accusations further, he would have serious problems. But his concerns were not just about his reputation. He still hadn't accepted defeat. Back at the Brown mansion, Andrew was keeping track of the unfolding crisis. He knew his family would suffer from the fallout. He had already received calls from investors uncertain about continuing their partnerships. The company was going to lose money. That much was inevitable, but he had no regrets. He was sitting in his office when the door slowly opened. Elizabeth walked in. Her eyes were sunken, her hands trembling slightly. Andrew watched her, waiting for her to speak first. She walked to the chair in front of him and sat down, keeping her gaze low for a long moment. "I was wrong," she said at last. Andrew leaned forward. He never expected to hear those words from her. Elizabeth took a deep breath. "For years, I did everything to keep this family at the top, to make sure Sarah had the best. But I didn't realize that in the middle of all this, I was sacrificing the only thing that truly mattered." She lifted her eyes, and Andrew saw something different in them. "I almost lost our daughter." There was a heavy silence before Andrew spoke. "But you didn't lose her." Elizabeth looked away again, breathing deeply. "I need to talk to her." Upstairs, Sarah was sitting at the edge of her bed, replaying everything that had happened that day. She still felt her body trembling. The fear, the relief, the uncertainty, everything mixed together. The door opened slowly and she looked up. Elizabeth stepped in, closing the door behind her. She stood there for a moment before walking over to the bed and sitting down beside her daughter. Sarah waited. Elizabeth opened her mouth to speak, but hesitated. "You were very brave today." Her daughter didn't respond right away. "I just did what had to be done." Elizabeth nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I spent so much time worrying about protecting this family that I ended up becoming a threat to you." Sarah bit her lip, holding back the tears. "I thought you would never realize." Elizabeth hesitantly extended her hand and took Sarah's. "Forgive me?" Sarah looked at her mother. For the first time, she saw sincerity in her eyes. There was a moment of silence before she gripped her mother's hand in return. "Yes." Elizabeth pulled her daughter into a tight embrace. And for the first time in years, Sarah felt like she had her mother back. The scandal from the interrupted wedding was still reverberating through Mexican society when the first formal accusations against Daniel began to surface. What had once been just a rumor confined to the most influential circles was now taking on an uncontrollable magnitude for him. Brian Ibanez, the former employee who had already helped Andrew and Robert, was the first to make his testimony official in front of the authorities. But he wasn't the only one. Daniel's public exposure encouraged others to come forward. Former employees from the Miller network, ex-business partners, and even some women who had been involved with him in the past began to speak up. The accusations went beyond financial blackmail. There were reports of coercion, manipulation, and psychological abuse. Testimonies revealed a pattern of destructive behavior in which Daniel used his influence to silence those who threatened his position. The prosecution opened a formal investigation. The evidence began to pile up, and for the first time, Daniel found himself cornered. His lawyers tried to discredit the witnesses, but the tide was already turning against him. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Sarah was trying to rebuild her life. After weeks of tension, she decided she needed professional help. Andrew, noticing the emotional toll on his daughter, encouraged her to seek therapy. At first, Sarah hesitated. For years, she had become accustomed to hiding her feelings, to ignoring her pain. But the conversation with her mother and her father's unwavering support made her realize that she didn't have to face this alone. In her first session, she felt vulnerable talking about her story. Discussing the months she had spent with Daniel, the constant fear and the weight of feeling surveilled was harder than she had imagined. But as time passed, she began to understand that, for the first time, she was truly freeing herself. Her therapist helped her see that the guilt was never hers to carry, that her voice mattered, and above all, that her story could help other women. Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening. Feminist movements and human rights organizations began to publicly show their support for Sarah. Her courageous act of rejecting Daniel at the altar had become a symbol of resistance. Social media was flooded with messages of support. Campaigns against abusive relationships used her story as an example that no one should be forced to stay in a situation that caused them pain. At first, Sarah felt overwhelmed. She didn't want to be seen as a public victim, but over time, she understood that this was bigger than her. While Sarah was rebuilding emotionally, Andrew was fighting to save Brown Enterprises from the financial crisis. The fallout from the scandal had driven some investors away. There was uncertainty in the market, and rumors about a potential bankruptcy started circulating. But Andrew wasn't a man who gave up easily. He used all the contacts who still trusted him to find a solution. And he did. After weeks of negotiations, he struck a deal with a European investor willing to inject capital into the company. It wasn't easy. There were losses, concessions, and changes to Brown Enterprises' structure. But in the end, the family name wasn't destroyed. Elizabeth, once obsessed with status, finally understood that the true value of the family wasn't in money, but in the bond they shared. Over time, Sarah started to feel stronger. Therapy had helped, but there was something more that gave her purpose. The certainty that her story couldn't just be another forgotten scandal. She began slowly. First, she talked to small organizations that helped women in similar situations to the one she had experienced. Then she started accepting invitations to speak at conferences. At first, talking about what she had gone through was painful. Reliving each detail, each moment of anguish with Daniel made her chest tighten. But then, she would look at the women in the audience. She saw understanding in their eyes, emotional faces. She knew that many of them had gone through the same, and she realized that her story was giving them the courage to speak up. Over time, she realized she had found her voice. She was no longer the bride who ran away at the altar. She was someone who survived, and she was ready to help other women survive too. Daniel wasn't used to losing. Since he could remember, he had been the man who controlled every situation in his favor. His marriage to Sarah was supposed to be just another calculated move, a game where he set the rules. But now, after the public humiliation, he found himself having to rebuild his image at any cost. The morning after the scandal, his team of lawyers and advisors was already working frantically to minimize the damage. An official statement was issued to the press, where Daniel expressed his deep regrets over Sarah's sudden nervous breakdown at the altar, subtly suggesting that the bride had simply lost her mind. A poor, emotionally unstable young woman, unable to handle the pressure of such a grand wedding. In discreet interviews, Daniel's allies began spreading the narrative that Sarah had a history of indecisiveness, that perhaps she was using the ceremony as a way to gain attention. Rumors started to circulate in high society, insinuating that she might have been involved with another man, that there was something behind her refusal to marry. Daniel didn't need evidence, just enough doubt to tarnish her credibility. But Sarah didn't falter. She had spent far too long being silenced, and now that she had finally found her voice, she wasn't going to let anyone silence her again. The problem, however, was that Daniel hadn't given up. In the following days, anonymous messages began arriving. Some, written in subtle tones, hinted that it would be better for Sarah to move on and forget the past. Others were more direct. If you keep going with this, you might regret it. People have lost everything for much less. The world forgets scandals, but it doesn't forgive those who try to take down the powerful. Andrew, realizing the danger, increased security around his daughter. Robert recommended that all the messages be recorded and forwarded to the authorities. Although there was no direct proof that Daniel was behind them, everyone knew this was his modus operandi. But Daniel had underestimated the domino effect the scandal had caused. With all eyes on him, new testimonies began to emerge. Former employees of the Miller network started to speak up. Businessmen who had been coerced by Daniel decided to break their silence. Leaked documents showed suspicious transactions, signs of manipulated contracts, and veiled threats to investors who didn't comply with his orders. The walls were closing in, and Andrew decided it was time for a direct confrontation. That night, he entered a discreet restaurant in downtown New York where a meeting had been scheduled. Daniel was already waiting at a reserved table in the corner of the room. He was impeccably dressed, but his demeanor no longer carried the unwavering arrogance it once had. Andrew sat down without saying a word. For a few seconds, the two men simply stared at each other. It was Daniel who broke the silence. "So this is what you wanted, to destroy my reputation?" Andrew didn't smile. "Your reputation, you destroyed that on your own." Daniel gripped his glass of wine tightly, swirling the liquid slowly. "You know this isn't over, right? I still have allies, I still have resources." "Not for long," Andrew shot back. "Every day more people are speaking up. People you've destroyed, threatened, bribed. You're alone, Daniel." Daniel's face remained impassive, but his eyes showed a flash of contained irritation. "You think you've beaten me?" Andrew leaned slightly forward. "I know I have." Daniel pressed his lips together and drank his wine in one swift motion. "You're making a mistake, Andrew. I still have cards to play." "Then play them already," Andrew challenged, "because time's running out for you." Daniel held his gaze for a few seconds before leaning back in his chair, forcing a smile. "You're a brave man. But bravery doesn't always protect a family." "My family is safe. Yours?" Andrew paused. "I don't know if they'll still stand by you when your fall is complete." Daniel didn't respond. He simply stood up, adjusted his suit, and walked out of the restaurant without looking back. Days later, the summons arrived. Officially, Daniel Miller was now the subject of an investigation. He was called in to testify about charges of extortion, bribery, and contract manipulation. His family, once unwaveringly by his side, began to distance themselves. Major investors pulled back, fearing the damage to their own reputations. His businesses, once untouchable, began to crumble. And Daniel, for the first time, felt what it was like to be truly cornered. Daniel had tried everything to reverse his downfall, but now there was no way out. The evidence against him was piling up at an accelerated pace. Testimonies from former employees, businessmen, and victims of his blackmail revealed the network of manipulation he had built over the years. The man who had once prided himself on controlling everything was now helplessly watching as his reputation was dismantled. The Mexican elite, who had once revered him, began to avoid him. Invitations to events disappeared, investors pulled away, and even his own family began to treat him like a problem to be forgotten. The final blow came when the prosecution formalized the criminal case. Accusations of extortion, bribery, and financial manipulation were officially filed, and Daniel went from a powerful man to a defendant facing justice. The press covered every detail of his downfall. The same newspapers that had once praised him now published relentless headlines. "Daniel Miller, from elite to scandal. The empire of blackmail comes to an end." Ex-fiancé exposes the truth about Daniel Miller. Daniel could no longer deny the reality. His mask had fallen, and no one was willing to help him put it back on. Meanwhile, the Brown family began to rise again. The financial storm that hit the company after the scandal was not easy to weather, but Andrew wouldn't let his family's legacy be destroyed. With careful negotiations and a new investor willing to bet on the future of Brown Enterprises, he managed to keep the business running, though on a smaller scale. For the first time in months, Andrew felt he could breathe easy. Looking at his daughter, he knew he had made the right choice. Saving the company could never have been more important than saving her. Sarah, on the other hand, was discovering a new purpose for her life. The therapy process she had started had helped her rebuild her self-esteem and deal with the trauma Daniel had left behind. But there was something bigger, something that drove her to transform her pain into something useful. That was when she accepted the invitation to speak at an event on psychological violence and emotional control. At first, the idea of sharing her story terrified her. Reliving every moment wouldn't be easy. But when she took the stage and saw the dozens of women watching her in silence, she knew she was exactly where she needed to be. For a long time, I believed I had no choice, that I was trapped in a situation with no way out. But when I found the courage to say no, I discovered that there was an entire life waiting for me on the other side of fear. The silence in the audience was followed by emotional applause. Sarah realized that, in speaking up, she wasn't just telling her story. She was giving a voice to so many other women who, like her, had been silenced. It was the beginning of something bigger. Meanwhile, at home, the relationship between Sarah and Elizabeth was also undergoing a transformation. After months of tension, Elizabeth finally understood that her obsession with status had almost cost her the most important thing: her daughter. The pride that had always prevented her from showing her emotions gave way to a sincerity that hadn't existed between them in years. One day, while they were having tea in the garden, Elizabeth took Sarah's hand and said something she had never said before. "I'm proud of you." Sarah felt her heart tighten. She hadn't expected to hear those words, not like that, not with so much truth. "Thank you, Mum." The family, once fragmented, was beginning to rebuild itself. One afternoon, Sarah walked alone through a park, feeling the gentle breeze against her skin. For the first time in a long time, her mind wasn't stuck in the past. She observed the people around her, the carefree laughter of a child, the sound of the leaves rustling in the wind. She took a deep breath and realized something simple but powerful. She was free. She no longer needed to look back in fear. She smiled as she remembered the day she said no in front of everyone. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where her life was hers and no one else's.